Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by Trackpads.com.
Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome.
Today, we go to the muddy fields outside New Orleans in the War of 1812 for the story of the Battle of New Orleans. For readers who want the fuller version, the longer print edition includes fact sheets and photos and is available on LinkedIn or by email.
The morning of January 8th, 1815, crept in under a low, wet fog along the Mississippi River below New Orleans. On a rough earthen wall behind a shallow ditch called the Rodriguez Canal, Andrew Jackson's mixed American line waited in the half-light. Boots sank into mud, breath steamed in the Gulf chill, and artillery pieces stood ready along a packed earth rampart. Cotton bales and barrels had come and gone as improvised cover, but what mattered now was the wall, the ditch, and the men who knew their ranges. In the stillness before the attack, the defenders could hear more than they could see, and every distant command in the fog sounded closer than it was.
Behind that wall stood a force that looked nothing like a neat European order of battle. There were United States Army regulars, frontier militia from Tennessee and Kentucky, New Orleans volunteers, companies of free men of color, sailors and gunners from the river, and Baratarian smugglers who had traded pardon for powder and shot. Some men had formal training, while others brought frontier marksmanship, river experience, or local knowledge of the bayous. It was a coalition built in a hurry, held together by Jackson's will and by the knowledge that this line guarded the city behind them.
Out in the fog, drums and muted commands carried across plowed fields and sugarcane stubble, where the British Army was forming. Many of those soldiers were veterans of the long war against Napoleon, and they expected to brush aside this rough American force once they closed. They had reason to trust their discipline, their officers, and their experience under fire. But this field was not a European plain, and the position in front of them had been shaped to make their strengths costly. Lanterns moved as officers tried to sort out scaling ladders and fascines meant to cross the canal, a small confusion that would soon grow into a serious problem.
On the American side, gunners stood by loaded pieces, while riflemen rested long barrels on the parapet and stared into gray nothing. Jackson moved along the line, raw-boned and restless, reminding his men that they held the last barrier between the British and New Orleans. When the fog began to lift, both sides could see how narrow the killing ground really was. River on one flank, cypress swamp on the other, and a muddy strip where disciplined ranks would have to walk into converging fire.
The soldiers on the line did not know that diplomats far away in Europe had already signed the Treaty of Ghent to end the war. Rumors of peace existed, but rumors did not stop musket balls. On the Chalmette plain, the fight was still real. For the men waiting by the canal, the War of 1812 had narrowed to one stretch of ditch and one cold winter morning.
To understand why that muddy line mattered, we have to look at the larger map. The War of 1812 had touched the Canadian border, the Atlantic coast, and the seas. But by late 1814, Britain had turned fresh attention to the Gulf Coast. New Orleans was not just another port. It sat near the mouth of the Mississippi River, the main artery of trade and movement for a growing western interior that stretched from Ohio farms to Tennessee and Kentucky.
For Britain, fresh from victory in Europe, taking New Orleans promised leverage far beyond the city's streets and warehouses. Control of the lower Mississippi could choke American commerce in the West, encourage talk of a separate Western Republic, and strengthen British influence at any peace table. It would also show that the United States could not reliably defend the doorway to its own Western growth. For the United States, losing the city could shake frontier loyalty
and call into question the young republic's ability to protect its own interior.
In New Orleans itself, those stakes produced local fear and tension. The city was a mix of Creole elites, American merchants, enslaved people, free people of color, and smugglers who knew every bayou. Rumors of British promises, uprisings, and shifting loyalties moved through taverns and along levees. People wondered who would resist, who would cooperate, and what would happen if a veteran British army appeared in the streets. Jackson understood that if the British broke his line and entered the city, he might lose more than a battle. He could lose Louisiana's trust, the Mississippi Gateway, and a key piece of the nation's future.
The road to the canal bank began months earlier, after British planners saw the Gulf Coast as a softer target than heavily defended Atlantic ports. In 1814, British forces burned public buildings in Washington and failed to take Baltimore, but the war remained unsettled. Naval strength and veteran troops could still strike where American defenses were thin. British ships probed the Louisiana coast, moving through bayous and lakes that locals understood better than outside officers.
Into this uncertainty came Andrew Jackson, a Tennessee lawyer turned general known for hard campaigns and a rough command style. When he reached New Orleans in December 1814, the defenses were weak and local politics were complicated. Jackson declared martial law, brushed aside hesitation, and began turning the city's divided population into a defensive force. His methods were harsh, but the timetable left little room for slow persuasion. He accepted free men of color into the line, bargained with Baratarians for skilled gunners and powder, and pulled militia from Tennessee and Kentucky alongside regular troops. Every new group strengthened the defense, while also adding problems of supply, discipline, and coordination.
The British advance through the bayous gave Jackson just enough warning to choose his ground. He settled on the Rodriguez Canal on the Chalmette plantation, a few miles below the city. The position narrowed the front and anchored one flank on the Mississippi and the other in the swamp. That choice mattered because it denied the British the broad maneuver room that experienced troops usually wanted. Engineers, laborers, soldiers, and volunteers dug and stacked until a continuous earthwork rose behind the ditch. Artillery positions were cut into the line so guns could sweep the open fields ahead and overlap their fire near the canal.
As Christmas passed, word of peace talks in Ghent reached the region, but no one knew whether an agreement was real or what it might mean. Even if peace had been reached, the commanders on the ground had no reliable way to know the final terms or whether the fighting should stop. British preparations continued, and Jackson did not loosen his grip on the city. Both sides planned as if the next blow could determine how the war would be remembered along the Mississippi.
By dawn on January 8th, the British had already tested Jackson's position through night attacks, artillery exchanges, and efforts to turn the flank. Those fights convinced their commanders that a concentrated frontal assault would be needed. On paper, the plan was direct. Seasoned infantry would move forward in the fog with ladders and fascines, cross the ditch, climb the earthwork, and break the mixed American army with bayonets and close-range fire. Artillery would support the advance, while a diversion near the river drew attention to the flank. It was a plan built on discipline, timing, and the assumption that veteran troops could absorb fire long enough to reach the wall.
Execution in the dark proved far less tidy. Key equipment was misplaced or delayed. Some units formed without the ladders they needed, while others struggled to align on wet ground broken by ditches and cane rows. Officers tried to keep their men dressed on the colors as they advanced toward a line they could hear more clearly than they could see. Even small mistakes mattered, because the plan left little margin once the columns entered the open fields. Drums and shouted orders could not turn mud, fog, and confusion into the neat assault imagined on maps.
On the American side, there was no grand maneuver, only disciplined waiting. Artillery officers had studied the fields in front of them
and knew where British columns would have to appear. Riflemen and musketmen along the parapet had spent days watching the same ground and rehearsing the loading motions that would keep up steady fire. The earthwork gave them confidence because it turned exposure into protection and made the enemy cross known ground. When the fog thinned, watchers caught their first clear glimpse of skirmishers and red ranks moving forward.
The American guns opened almost at once. Canister tore into tight formations from the front and flank, while rifle shots snapped at officers trying to restore order. The sound of the line changed from waiting silence to continuous violence, with gun crews and riflemen feeding one another's fire. Gaps opened faster than they could be closed. Some British units pressed on, splashing into the canal or trying to climb the muddy bank under direct fire. Others paused as they realized the slope ahead was swept by overlapping guns from the riverside and inland positions. The missing or delayed ladders and fascines made the canal a real obstacle rather than a detail in the plan. Every pause under that fire became deadly.
What turned the battle was not one heroic countercharge, but a pattern of advantages that all ran in the same direction. The British advanced in tight formations across open, muddy ground. The Americans fired from behind a prepared earthwork that multiplied the strength of a mixed force. Canister cut lanes through the ranks, while long rifles and muskets targeted officers, colors, and exposed groups. The narrow field between river and swamp forced the British to keep feeding men into a zone the defenders had already measured. Jackson's casualties remained comparatively low because most of his men fought behind earth and timber. The British paid for every yard.
Command misfortune made the problem worse. Senior British officers moved forward to rally the attack and became clear targets. Sir Edward Pakenham was mortally wounded while trying to push his men over the canal, and other senior officers were hit in quick succession. As leadership fell, battalions lost coordination. Some held in place, some still tried to reach the ditch, and others fell back in disorder. What had been planned as a single crushing blow became isolated efforts walking into the same prepared fire. Jackson's most important decisions had been made before dawn. By standing behind the canal instead of meeting the British in the open, he turned a rough, uneven army into an anchored line. Baratarians and regular artillerymen worked their guns with practiced rhythm. Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen used the wall as protection while firing into the exposed advance. Regulars and volunteers held together because the position gave every group a clear job and a clear field of fire. For any British unit that reached the canal, the final yards were the worst because direct and flanking fire met there. Eventually, British commanders understood that no fresh push would succeed. The earthwork had not been cracked, the canal had not been forced, and too many leaders and soldiers were down. Orders moved to withdraw. Some units stepped back in reasonable order. Others left wounded men, broken ladders, and fallen flags in the mud. The field in front of the canal had become a visible record of failed assumptions, that the defenders would waver, that the obstacle could be crossed quickly, and that European battlefield experience would carry the attack through. In a few hours, the assault force had been badly damaged and had gained nothing. The path to New Orleans remained blocked, and the confidence behind the British assault had been replaced by the sober reality of a position that could not be forced cheaply. When the guns fell quiet, the immediate outcome was clear. The British attack had failed with heavy casualties, including experienced veterans who had survived years of war in Europe. Jackson's losses were comparatively small, and his line still guarded the approach to the city. The contrast between the two casualty lists gave the battle much of its later power in American memory. British commanders shifted to bombardment and maneuver, but the hope of storming New Orleans by direct infantry attack had been crushed. Within weeks, British forces withdrew from the region.
Strategically, the victory did not change the terms of the Treaty of Ghent, which had already been signed. But news traveled slowly, and in North America, the sequence mattered. Americans heard that a young republic had met a seasoned British army and won overwhelmingly. That story reached communities that had spent years hearing of raids, blockades, failed invasions, and the burning of public buildings in Washington. New Orleans helped wash away some of that humiliation and replaced it with a narrative of resilience, competence, and national survival.
The battle also turned Andrew Jackson into a national figure. His willingness to improvise, enforce discipline, and trust a mixed force of regulars, militia, free men of color, sailors, and former smugglers shaped how many Americans imagined leadership in crisis. Later politics would complicate his legacy, and any honest account has to recognize that complexity. But the image of Jackson at New Orleans, lean, forceful, and victorious on a muddy line, became one of the powerful symbols of early 19th century America.
For veterans, the memory was more personal. Mud, smoke, fear, and friends lost under sudden fire. British survivors carried the shock of an attack that had promised momentum and instead ended in wreckage. American survivors remembered the strange mix of relief and disbelief that followed the collapse of the assault. For public memory, New Orleans became proof that earthworks, rifles, artillery, and timing could allow a smaller republic to hold its own against a major power. Today, the Chalmette battlefield is quieter ground, marked by monuments and levees. Visitors walk the line where the canal once ran and imagine fog lifting over red ranks under fire.
The lesson is not that New Orleans alone won the War of 1812. The diplomatic end had already been set elsewhere. The lesson is that battles fought after treaties can still shape how nations remember conflict. They influence how citizens think about volunteers and regulars, preparation and improvisation, and the link between local ground and national fate. Standing on that old canal bank, the distance between a fragile republic and a more self-confident United States feels shorter than the years suggest.
You can hear this story and others like it in the Dispatch audio editions of Headline Wednesday. And you can find more daily discussion of United States military history in the United States Military History Group on LinkedIn. Headline Wednesday is developed by Trackpads.com as part of Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine.